The morning of November 18, 1942, hung thick and heavy over Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Humidity wrapped around everything like a suffocating blanket as 16 Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters touched down on the steel matting runway. The 339th Fighter Squadron had arrived, their wheels hitting the tarmac with a series of metallic clangs that echoed across the airfield. Hidden deep in the jungle surrounding the base, Japanese observers watched and radioed back to Rabaul. The messages they sent carried barely concealed amusement. These were not the sleek, nimble fighters the Japanese had expected from America. These were not the dogfighters built to challenge Zero supremacy. Instead, they saw massive twin-engine machines with distinctive twin booms that seemed to violate every principle of aerial combat the Japanese had perfected. To eyes trained on the elegant simplicity of the Mitsubishi A6M0, everything about these aircraft appeared wrong. Too heavy, too complex, too American in their excessive engineering. The Japanese had refined their fighter through subtraction, removing every unnecessary gram, minimizing every component, achieving extraordinary maneuverability through pure design philosophy. The Americans had done the opposite. They had added engines, added weight, added complexity. At Rabaul, Japanese Navy headquarters of the 11th Air Fleet received these reports with satisfaction. The assessment seemed to confirm what officers had believed since Pearl Harbor. Americans relied on material excess because they lacked the warrior spirit that made Japanese pilots invincible. But what none of them understood was that this moment would set in motion the most profound transformation in Japanese naval aviation doctrine. In just 5 months, one impossible mission would dismantle every assumption about American capabilities. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to be rewritten, not through traditional dogfights, but through a new dimension of warfare the Japanese had never imagined. Long-range precision interception that would culminate in the death of their most irreplaceable asset. The gathering confidence and dismissive attitudes had begun months earlier, in August 1942, when Japanese intelligence first reported these strange new fighters appearing in the Aleutian Islands. On August 9th of that year, 2 P-38s from the 343rd Fighter Group had shot down a pair of Japanese Kawanishi H-6K flying boats. These were the first Japanese aircraft destroyed by lightnings. But this distant action in the fog-shrouded Aleutians seemed irrelevant to the main theater of operations. The initial Japanese intelligence assessment, distributed to fighter units in September 1942, reflected deep institutional overconfidence. The report stated that the twin-engine design represented an American tendency toward mechanical complexity over combat efficiency. It predicted that such aircraft would prove inferior to Japanese fighters in all combat situations requiring maneuverability. Among the officers reviewing these reports was Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack. His assessment, recorded in official Navy documents, stated that the Americans, having failed to match the Zero with conventional fighters, now resorted to unconventional designs. Every additional component represented another point of failure. The Zero was born from warrior philosophy, maximum result from minimum material. These American machines represented the opposite. The initial encounters seemed to confirm Japanese confidence when P-38s began operating from Guadalcanal in November 1942. Japanese pilots reported that the American fighters appeared reluctant to engage in traditional dogfights. This reluctance was interpreted as fear rather than tactical discipline. The first real combat between P-38s and Japanese fighters occurred on November 18, 1942, over Guadalcanal. Pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, escorting Boeing B-17 bombers, claimed 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed. While modest in scale, this engagement demonstrated something new. The P-38s had refused to be drawn into turning fights, instead making high-speed passes from altitude, diving and climbing away before Japanese fighters could respond. But December 27, 1942, provided the first serious shock. 12 P-38s from the 39th Fighter Squadron encountered a Japanese force over Dobodura, New Guinea. The engagement was brief but decisive. The P-38s maintained their altitude advantage and refused to engage in maneuver combat. destroying multiple Japanese aircraft while suffering minimal losses. The Japanese Navy's 4th Air Group War Diary, captured after the war, recorded growing concern. An entry from December 1942 noted that the twin-engine fighters appeared over Japanese bases at altitudes Japanese fighters struggled to reach. When Japanese pilots climbed to engage, the Americans dove through their formations at exceptional speed, fired their weapons, and climbed away before effective response was possible. The most troubling aspect for Japanese pilots was how the P-38 appeared immune to traditional tactics. The Zero's legendary maneuverability, which had dominated every opponent since China, seemed irrelevant against an enemy that refused to turn and fight. The Japanese intelligence assessment of the P-38, revised in January 1943, still reflected dangerous underestimation. The report distributed to all fighter units stated that the Lockheed twin-engine fighter represented American industrial philosophy rather than combat effectiveness. The assessment estimated maximum speed at 350 miles per hour, service ceiling at approximately 30,000 feet, and range at 500 to 600 miles. The nose-mounted machine guns were noted, followed by a tactical assessment concluding that the aircraft's weight and complexity made it vulnerable to Japanese fighters in traditional combat. Pilots were instructed to force close-range engagements where Japanese superiority was absolute. The reality was starkly different from what these reports suggested. The P-38 models arriving in the Pacific could achieve 400 miles per hour in level flight, climb to 40,000 feet, and with drop tanks could strike targets over 1,000 miles away. The concentrated firepower of 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon mounted in the nose provided devastating accuracy. By January 1943, American pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the P-38's advantages. Major John Mitchell, who would later lead the Yamamoto mission, was refining these tactics with the 339th Fighter Squadron. The fundamental rule was simple and uncompromising. Never surrender the energy advantage to engage in maneuver combat with Japanese fighters. Maintain altitude, maintain speed. Strike and depart. From March 2nd through March 4th, 1943, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea provided evidence that should have shattered Japanese complacency entirely. P-38s flew top cover as American and Australian bombers annihilated a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Lae. 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers went down. The P-38s claimed numerous aerial victories while successfully protecting the attacking bombers. Japanese survivor accounts, recorded in post-war interrogations, described the P-38s maintaining station at altitudes the Zero escort struggled to reach. When Japanese fighters finally climbed to engagement altitude, they found themselves at an energy disadvantage that proved fatal. Even this disaster was rationalized in Japanese reports. The official assessment blamed numerical inferiority and surprise rather than acknowledging American technological and tactical superiority. This institutional denial would persist until it was far too late. On April 1, 1943, Operation I-Go was launched from Rabaul. Admiral Yamamoto himself had come forward to direct operations personally. This was to be a massive aerial counteroffensive intended to crush American air power in the Solomon Islands and demonstrate continued Japanese superiority. The results of Operation Y-Go were catastrophically misreported to Japanese high command. Pilots claimed fantastic victories, dozens of American aircraft destroyed, multiple ships sunk. The actual American losses were minimal, while Japanese aircraft losses, many to P-38s, were substantial. It was in this atmosphere of false confidence that Yamamoto made his fatal decision. He chose to conduct an inspection tour of forward bases, a decision that would place him within range of American P-38s operating from Guadalcanal. The directives that emerged were stark and unforgiving. Attack only when enemies committed themselves to ground operations or bomber escort missions. Disengage immediately if they maintained the altitude advantage. These orders represented nothing short of a complete reversal of everything Japanese fighter philosophy had always stood for. For years, the emphasis had been on aggressive engagement and spiritual superiority, prioritizing warrior spirit over the material facts of engineering and production. Throughout 1943, the accumulation of losses became impossible to ignore. The P-38 moved systematically through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, methodically dismantling what remained of Japanese air power. The cost in experienced pilots was absolutely catastrophic. American pilots who went down usually survived. The P-38's ability to limp home on a single engine saved lives. Rescue operations plucked survivors from the ocean and jungle. But Japanese pilots, their losses were almost always fatal. By September 1943, nearly all the pilots who had received pre-war training were gone, dead or missing. Their replacements came through abbreviated training programs, rushed and inadequate. These younger men lacked the skills and experience needed to match the increasingly proficient American pilots they faced. The numbers painted a devastating picture. A pilot arriving from Japan in 1943 brought roughly 200 flight hours. American P-38 pilots showed up with 400 hours or more. After 10 missions, Japanese pilots had a 40% survival rate. American pilots survived at 80%. The mathematics were relentless and brutal. The P-38 revealed yet another dimension to its superiority, one that fundamentally changed Pacific warfare. It could escort bombers across ranges that no Japanese fighter could possibly match. The B-24 Liberators, once vulnerable to being picked off during long missions, now struck targets throughout the Japanese defensive perimeter with P-38 protection that stayed with them from takeoff to landing. Every calculation favored the Americans. A single P-38 could protect bombers flying 1,000-mile missions. The Zero's combat radius, even with a drop tank attached, barely reached 600 miles. This meant American bombers could launch from bases so distant that Japanese fighters could never reach them, yet still enjoy fighter cover the entire way. Charles Lindbergh arrived in the Pacific in 1944 as a civilian technical representative. He came to teach P-38 pilots techniques for improved cruise control. His methods worked. Combat radius increased dramatically. Some estimates suggest as much as 30% improvement in effective range. But Lindbergh did more than optimize fuel efficiency. He demonstrated how the P-38 could serve as a fighter bomber as well, showing pilots how to deliver bombs with precision while maintaining combat capability. This versatility only widened the already substantial gap between American and Japanese capabilities. By June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea provided the clearest possible evidence of how thoroughly the balance had shifted. While F-6F Hellcats carried most of the fighter engagement, P-38s operating from land bases provided reconnaissance and long-range cover that helped orchestrate the slaughter that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation, once the world's most elite force, was decimated. The few Japanese pilots who survived reported a nightmare made real. American fighters, including P-38s, appeared to be everywhere at once. They held altitude advantage. They possessed superior numbers. There seemed no escape. Throughout 1944, American P-38 pilots competed in what they called the ace race. The results spoke volumes. Major Richard Bong achieved 40 confirmed kills, all in P-38s. Major Thomas Maguire scored 38 victories, every single one from a P-38 cockpit. Colonel Charles MacDonald reached 27 kills. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Johnson claimed 22. These achievements came in roughly 2 years of combat. Most surviving Japanese aces, despite flying since 1937, couldn't match these totals. The P-38 had become an ace-making machine. By 1945, Japanese naval aviation had ceased to exist as any kind of fighting force. The P-38, working alongside other American fighters, had destroyed not just aircraft, but the entire accumulated knowledge of Japanese naval aviation itself. Post-war Japanese technical evaluations revealed the full extent of their strategic miscalculation. The P-38 represented design concepts we failed to comprehend. Redundancy over simplicity. Twin engines meant survival capability. Energy tactics replaced maneuver tactics. Firepower concentration mattered more than dispersion. Multi-role capability trumped specialization. Pilot protection outweighed weight savings. Every feature dismissed as excessive proved absolutely decisive when the shooting started. The numbers tell the true story. P-38s destroyed over 1,800 confirmed Japanese aircraft, including Admiral Yamamoto's G4M on April 18, 1943. Lockheed manufactured 10,037 P-38s total. Peak production exceeded 400 aircraft monthly during 1944. The aircraft flew over 65,000 sorties throughout the Pacific. Missions varied constantly: fighter sweeps, bomber escort, ground attack, reconnaissance. Average range extended well beyond 600 miles. The Yamamoto mission shattered Japanese morale with devastating and irreversible force. Strategically, Japan lost its most capable naval strategist. Psychologically, the mission conveyed a chilling message: no Japanese leader was beyond American reach. The production comparison exposed the fundamental futility of Japanese resistance. While Japan struggled to produce 300 to 400 fighters monthly across all types combined, Lockheed alone manufactured over 400 P-38s during peak months. Simultaneously, America mass-produced P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, F-6F Hellcats, and F-4U Corsairs in staggering numbers. Every American aircraft came from assembly lines, ensuring consistent quality, incorporating continuous improvements derived directly from combat experience. Japanese aircraft faced a different reality. Built increasingly by conscripted labor using inferior materials, quality deteriorated steadily as the war progressed. The pilot training disparity became the single most decisive factor. American P-38 pilots trained for over 200 initial flight hours. Advanced training consumed 100 additional hours, then 50-plus hours specifically on the P-38. They arrived in combat with 400 flight hours behind them. Japanese pilots in 1944, they received 100 to 150 total hours, often fewer than 20 hours on their assigned aircraft. Fuel shortages prevented extensive training. Flight instructors got pulled out to fly combat missions. The result was devastatingly predictable. American P-38 pilots joined squadrons staffed with combat veterans who transmitted hard-won wisdom and experience. Japanese pilots arrived barely capable of formation flying, frequently killed on their first engagement. The Japanese strategy documents from 1944 reveal the psychological impact the P-38 had achieved. All fleet movements must account for P-38 reconnaissance and strike capability. Daylight operations within their range invite destruction. This restricts our operational flexibility to an intolerable degree. By 1944, the P-38's reach covered most of the Western Pacific, fundamentally constraining Japanese operational freedom. Japanese commanders could no longer operate freely in daylight within P-38 range. Late in the war, P-38J and L models addressed every combat deficiency that had been identified. Improved engines, hydraulically boosted ailerons, better cockpit heating, and dive brakes made the Lightning superior in every performance envelope. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to keep the obsolete Zero in production. Resources for developing advanced fighters simply didn't exist in meaningful quantities. Late-war Japanese designs like the N1K2J George and Ki-84 Frank were excellent aircraft, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter anything. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese pilots revealed complete transformation in their understanding of the P-38. Lieutenant Commander Sadamu Kumachi, speaking in 1946, reflected on the bitter lessons learned. "We began the war believing our spirit and skill were superior to American materialism. The P-38 proved that properly employed technology defeats spirit. You cannot fight physics with courage." Captain Takayo Tanamizu, credited with 32 victories, survived and later explained, "The P-38 was not the best turning fighter, not the fastest, not the highest flying, but it was good enough at everything, and it was everywhere. We called them twin-tailed shadows because they seemed to be waiting wherever we flew." In 1962, at a joint U.S.-Japanese aviation history symposium, veterans from both nations discussed the P-38's profound impact. Former Captain Minoru Genda, by then serving in Japan's parliament, made a striking admission. The P-38 was the first clear signal that we had fundamentally misunderstood modern war. When it killed Admiral Yamamoto, it killed more than a man. It killed our entire concept of warfare. We thought wars were won by superior warriors. The Americans proved wars are won by superior systems. Major John Mitchell, who led the Yamamoto mission, responded directly. We couldn't build a fighter that could outturn a Zero, so we built one that didn't need to. That's the American way. If you can't win their game, change the game entirely. In 1985, at a Pacific Theater reunion in Hawaii, surviving Japanese naval aviator Kenji Yanagiya, who had flown escort for Admiral Yamamoto, offered these reflections. We dismissed your P-38 in 1942 because we measured it by our standards. We valued elegance. You valued effectiveness. We sought perfection in one dimension. You sought adequacy in all dimensions. We built the ultimate sword. You built a gun that made swords irrelevant. The mission that killed Yamamoto represented far more than a successful intercept. It was a demonstration. The message conveyed that America could reach anywhere, strike anyone, with an aircraft they had dismissed as impractical. But the deepest lesson was this: modern war is not about individual excellence, but about systems. Not about warrior spirit, but about industrial capacity. Not about elegant solutions, but about practical ones. The laughter Japan directed at the P-38 in 1942 ended permanently on April 18, 1943. By 1944, those twin-tailed fighters dominated the skies. The laughter died when commanders realized they weren't fighting individual pilots. They were fighting an entire industrial system, producing quality in overwhelming quantity. 16 P-38s took off from Guadalcanal that morning, flying 435 miles across open ocean. Navigation relied on compass and clock. They intercepted their target within 60 seconds of planned arrival. Combat lasted less than 10 minutes. One aircraft failed to return. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was American planning, training, and technology functioning exactly as intended. The Japanese commanders who had laughed at the P-38 in November 1942 learned the hardest lesson about modern warfare. Never mistake different for inferior. Never confuse complexity with weakness. Never laugh at the future when it arrives on twin engines, armed with American firepower and aimed by American resolve. Admiral Yamamoto's death marked the moment when Japanese naval aviation's fate was irrevocably sealed. The P-38 demonstrated that American intelligence, planning, and technology could project power across vast distances to strike with surgical precision. Those 16 fighters carried more than fuel and ammunition that morning. They carried the message that industrial warfare had arrived. Wars would no longer be decided by the courage of individual warriors. They would be won by capacity to produce superior weapons in overwhelming quantity, to train pilots systematically, and to employ technology intelligently. From November 1942, when Japanese commanders first laughed at the ungainly twin-boomed fighters appearing at Guadalcanal, to April 1943, when those same fighters killed their nation's most important leader, to 1945, when P-38s roamed freely over the Japanese home islands themselves, the transformation was absolute. Japanese leaders had laughed at complexity, discovering too late that it was sophistication. They had mocked excess, only to learn it was abundance. They had dismissed the P-38 as too American, too large, too complicated, too mechanical. These very qualities made it perfect for the war America intended to fight. The laughter lasted 5 months. The consequences would last forever. The P-38 Lightning didn't merely shoot down Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943. It shot down an entire philosophy of warfare, proving conclusively that in modern conflict the assembly line defeats the samurai sword, the slide rule defeats warrior spirit, and industrial mathematics defeats individual courage. All that remained after that was the drone of twin Allison engines, carrying American power wherever it chose to go, striking whenever it chose to strike. The lightning had struck. The age of the samurai had ended. The American century had begun. The rising sun finally set on August 15, 1945.